Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 3. These are the tough issues that anyone doing serious study of this psalm is going to have to deal with. And each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 3, the top 3 issues all have to do with verbs. We have the verbal semantics in verse 5, the verbal semantics in verse 6, and the verbal semantics in the second half of verse 8. The first issue is the verbal semantics in verse 5. The ESV and most of the ancient translations interpret the verbs in this verse as past tense. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. So according to this view, the psalmist is recounting something that happened in the past. He called out to the Lord, and the Lord answered. Other translations, like the NEB, have present tense verbs here. I cry aloud to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. According to this view, the verse is not recounting a specific past event, but is describing something that happens again and again. The REB makes this habitual interpretation explicit. As often as I cry aloud to the Lord, he answers me from his holy mountain. So which interpretation of the verbs is more likely? The past tense interpretation or the general present habitual interpretation? When working through a verbal semantics issue like this one, we have to look at 2 things: the form of the verbs and the context. All things being equal, the best interpretation is the one that best accounts for the choice of verb form and makes the best sense in the context. Let's look first at the form, or the morphology, of each of the verbs in this verse. The first verb, the one translated call out or cry out, is a yiktol verb, ekra. And knowing that this first verb is a yiktol doesn't help us a whole lot, because yiktol verbs, it seems, can describe either habitual events or simple past events. The use of yiktol for habitual events is very common. In fact, this seems to be the typical way to refer to habitual events in biblical Hebrew. To give just one of many examples, Psalm 1 verse 3 says, "He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers." The habitual events, seasonal yield of fruit and continual flourishing, are expressed with yiktol verbs. And it's really hard to imagine any other verb form used in a context like this. Yiktol is the verb of choice for habitual events. But yiktol can also refer to simple past events, or at least so it appears. This use of yiktol is less prototypical and more controversial, but there are some clear examples. The old poem in Deuteronomy 32, for example, says, "He found him in a desert land. He encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest," and so on. The last verb in this passage is another example of the normal habitual use of yiktol, like an eagle that stirs up. But all of the other yiktols in this passage seem to refer to simple past events. He found, he encircled, he cared for, he kept. And so the verb in Psalm 3:5 could either be a simple past yiktol, like the ones in Deuteronomy 32, or a more typical habitual yiktol. We need to keep digging to find out which is more likely. The second verb in verse 5, the one translated answers, is a vayiktol verb, vaya'aneni. Vayiktol verbs are often used in biblical Hebrew narratives to describe the narrative's main sequence of events. And God said, and God saw, and then God made, etc. This past tense narrative use of vayiktol is so common that some would even consider vayiktol as a past tense narrative form. And so some would argue that the verbs in Psalm 3 verse 5 must be past tense because we have a past tense narrative form here in verse 5b. The Net Bible note, for example, says, the prefixed verbal form, ekra, the yiktol verb, could be an imperfect, yielding the translation, I cry out, but the verb form in the next line, a vav consecutive with the preterite, that is a vayiktol, suggests this is a brief narrative of what has already happened. But in our view, vayiktol is not inherently past tense. It doesn't really have any tense in and of itself. Instead, it continues the semantics of the previous verb, whether past, present, or future. In fact, there are several examples where vayiktol follows yiktol, like it does here in Psalm 3:5, and both verbs communicate habitual events, not past events. So to give just one example, Psalm 94, verses 5 through 6 says, "They kill the widow and the stranger. They murder the orphan. And they say, the Lord does not see, the God of Jacob does not perceive." Here, yiktol verbs are used to describe habitual events. They kill, they murder, and then the habitual semantics of yiktol are continued by a vayiktol form, and they say, vayomru. And there are many other examples of vayiktol, not as a past tense form, but continuing habitual semantics. For example, Psalm 94 verses 5 through 6 says, "They kill the widow and the stranger. They murder the orphan. And they say, the Lord does not see, the God of Jacob does not perceive." Here, yiktol verbs are used to describe habitual events. They kill, they murder, and then the habitual semantics of yiktol are continued by a vayiktol form. And they say, vayomru. And there are many other examples of vayiktol, not as a past tense form, but continuing habitual semantics. So the verbs in Psalm 3:5 don't have to be past tense just because there's a vayiktol verb in the second half of the verse. They might be past tense, but that wouldn't be because of the verb forms per se. In the end, the context is how we decide between the past tense interpretation and the habitual interpretation. So let's take a closer look at the context. Psalm 3 has 4 sections. The first section, verses 2 to 3, is about the psalmist's enemies, and it concludes with the word Selah. The second section, verses 4 through 5, begins with the pronoun you, but you, Lord, and it also concludes with the word Selah. The third section, verses 6 through 7, begins with the pronoun I. I lay down and fell asleep. And then the last section is verses 8 through 9, where the psalmist asks God to rise up and save him. And you can see our poetic structure layer for more details on this fourfold division of the psalm. For now, the main thing to note is that verse 5 is part of the same section with verse 4. And verse 4 gives a general, timeless description of who God is. You, Lord, are a shield for me, my honor, and the one who lifts my head. In this general present context, the yiktol verb that begins verse 5 is most likely a general present or a habitual. I call out to the Lord and he answers me. Or whenever I call out to the Lord, he answers me. And so the whole section, verses 4 through 5, is describing the kind of relationship that the Lord has with the psalmist. He is his shield, the one who lifts his head, and he always answers when the psalmist calls. This interpretation accounts for the choice of verb form, yiktol followed by vayiktol, and it makes the best sense in the context. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest, D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. The second issue in Psalm 3 is in the very next verse, and again, it has to do with verbs. Many modern translations translate all of the verbs in this verse as presents or habituals. The NRSV, for example, says, I lie down and sleep, I wake again, for the Lord sustains me. Other translations have all past tense verbs. So the ESV, for example, says, I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. And then some translations have 3 past tense verbs followed by a habitual verb. The Net says, I rested and slept. I awoke, for the Lord protects me. There are 4 verbs in this verse. First verb is a katal verb, shachavti. The second is a vayiktol, vaishana. The third is another katal verb, hakitzoti. And the last one is a yiktol, yismacheni. The first 3 verbs describe a sequence of events: laying down, falling asleep, waking up. And then the fourth verb gives some kind of explanation for these events. The main question is whether the first 3 verbs, lying down, falling asleep, waking up, describe past actions or habitual actions. Now, in our view, this issue is less complicated than the last issue in verse 5. Katal verbs, like we have with the verbs for laying down and waking up, are typically past perfective. As the Biblical Hebrew Reference Grammar says, referring to a situation in the past as a whole is one of the prototypical uses of katal/perfect. By contrast, as we saw in the last issue, habitual events are typically described with yiktol verbs, not katal verbs. There are some cases where katal appears to describe a habitual event. This is especially common in Hebrew proverbs. So for example, Proverbs 14:6 says, "When pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with the humble is wisdom." The verbs translated pride comes and then comes disgrace are katal verbs, and the verbs translated pride comes and then comes disgrace are a katal verb and a vayiktol verb. Katal is typically past tense, but here it's used in a proverb to describe a timeless truth. But this alleged habitual or gnomic use of katal is largely restricted to proverbs like the one we just read. And even then, the katal form in these proverbs might still be past tense, and these proverbs are just mini stories using past tense language to communicate timeless truths. First came pride, then came disgrace. It's a mini story using past tense language, but aimed at communicating a timeless truth. We do the same thing in English. Think, for example, of the English proverb, curiosity killed the cat. Killed is a past tense verb, but the proverb has timeless significance. The same thing might be happening with katal verbs in Hebrew proverbs. And so coming back to Psalm 3, it's difficult to interpret the katal verbs here in this context as anything other than past tense. I lay down and fell asleep, I woke up. If the psalmist wanted to refer to habitual events, I lie down and fall asleep, then he would have used yiktol verbs like he did in the previous verse. In this case, the verb forms themselves, katal continued by vayiktol, strongly suggest a past tense interpretation. And this interpretation makes good sense in the context. According to the superscription of Psalm 3, David is on the run from Absalom his son. He would have been vulnerable during the night, but he says the Lord protected him, and he survived the night. And so now he prays the morning after, reflecting on how God protected him the previous night, and he says, I lay down and fell asleep. I woke up because the Lord supports me. The last verb in this verse, the yiktol verb, yismacheni, could either be an imperfect past tense verb, the Lord was supporting me, or a general present habitual verb, the Lord supports me. Either view makes sense in the context. We've taken the general present interpretation, since this seems to be a more typical meaning of yiktol, and it works well here. The Lord habitually, characteristically supports David, and that support was evident last night when he was able to sleep in safety. In conclusion, we interpret the sequence of verbs in verse 6 as describing a short, past tense narrative. I lay down and fell asleep, I woke up. And then the last verb explains how this sequence of events was possible. Because the Lord supports me. We give this interpretation of the verbs in verse 6 an A rating. The third issue in Psalm 3 is in verse 8. And again, it has to do with the meaning of the verbs. The first two verbs in verse 8 are imperatives. Rise up, Lord, save me, my God. And everyone seems to agree on how to read these two verbs. The debate comes in the rest of the verse. The NASB goes on to say, for you have smitten all my enemies on the cheek. You have shattered the teeth of the wicked. The ESV says, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. And the NIV says, strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. So according to the NASB, we have past tense verbs. According to the ESV, general present or habitual verbs, and according to the NIV, imperatives. In Hebrew, the two verbs in this verse are katal verbs, shibarta and hikita, like the verbs we saw in the last issue. And as we saw in the last issue, the one on verse 6, katal verbs are typically past tense. This is why the NASB translation uses past tense or present perfect verbs. You have smitten, you have shattered. The ESV has present tense habitual verbs. You strike, you break. As we saw with the last issue, this general present interpretation of katal verbs is not likely, at least not in this kind of context. It's usually associated with proverbs, and even there, the forms might be past tense. So the ESV's interpretation of the verbs in this verse seems unlikely. The NIV's interpretation is interesting. Why would it translate katal verbs as imperatives? Well, some scholars have argued that the katal form in biblical Hebrew sometimes functions like an imperative. So, for example, the grammar by Waltke and O'Connor says the perfective, that is the katal form, can be used with reference to situations the speaker prays for and expects to be realized. This use of the perfective form can be recognized by the presence of other unambiguous forms in the context, signifying a volitional mood. This use occurs about 20 times in the Psalms. So, in other words, according to Waltke and O'Connor, whenever a katal occurs in a context with imperatives or other volitional verbs, the katal can function like an imperative. It can refer to the situation that the speaker is praying for and that he expects to be realized. The problem is that this category, the so-called precative katal, or the precative perfect, doesn't have any solid evidence to support it. John Cook calls the category dubious. And similarly, the Biblical Hebrew Reference Grammar says, in most of these instances, it is also possible to postulate that one of the more typical senses of the katal perfect is involved. We would agree with this critique. All of the examples listed by Waltke and O'Connor can be explained and are better explained with reference to more typical uses of the katal. Another problem with the precative interpretation in Psalm 3:8 is the key at the beginning of verse 8b. Normally, key is a conjunction that introduces some reason or explanation for something in the preceding discourse. It's usually translated for or because. But those who argue for a precative interpretation of the verbs in verse 8 have to explain the key as something else, as some kind of asseverative particle meaning yes or something like that. The NIV doesn't translate it at all. But the interpretation of the key as an asseverative particle here is problematic. Normally in the Psalms, when we have an imperative followed by a key and a katal verb, the key plus katal give a reason for the preceding imperative. They ground the speech act. So, for example, Psalm 5:11 says, "Declare them guilty, God. Drive them out. For, key, they have rebelled against you." Psalm 6:3 says, "Heal me, Lord, for, key, my bones are dismayed." And there are dozens more examples like these. When we read Psalm 3:8 in light of these examples and in keeping with the typical interpretation of both key and katal, the verse makes sense. In verse 8a, the psalmist asks the Lord to rise up and save him from his enemies, and then in verse 8bc, he grounds his request in the Lord's past action. As one scholar helpfully explains, the help experienced in the past justifies the current request. You have helped me in the past. Up until now, you've defeated all my enemies, and so, on this basis, I ask now with confidence that you would rise up and save me once more. We give this interpretation an A rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. The second section of the psalm, verses 4 through 5, gives a general, timeless description of who the Lord is and how he relates to the psalmist. The Lord is his shield and the one who lifts his head, and every time he calls to the Lord answers. The third section of the psalm, verses 6 and 7, moves from general to specific, applying the truths of verses 4 through 5 to the present situation. In verse 6, the psalmist reflects on the previous night. He lay down and fell asleep, and he was able to wake up again without being harmed because the Lord supports him. And this recent experience demonstrates what he claimed in the previous section, that the Lord is a shield for him. And then in the last section of the psalm, verses 8 and 9, he calls on the Lord to rise up and rescue him. And he grounds this request in God's past action. Up until this point, God has defeated all of his enemies. And then in the last section of the psalm, he calls on the Lord to rise up and rescue him. and he grounds his request in God's past action. Up until this point, God has defeated all of his enemies, and this gives him the confidence to ask now that God would rise up and defeat his enemies once more. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 3, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. All of our videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at Scriptura.org to learn more.